Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program that we campaigned on. So Trump's going into office next week, and let's get an update on his crime spree. He's been committing crimes his whole life, hasn't had to pay for it. And so now there are 4 cases that were going on while he was running for president. And let's just look at where they stand now. There was the Georgia election interference case where we got Trump on tape asking the Secretary of State to, add some votes so he could win that state. He's guilty as can be. Everybody knows it. But it looks like Trump's getting off. The Fulton County District Attorney, Fani Willis, is fighting in court now to stay on the case after an appeals court ruled she should be removed for a conflict of interest because she had an affair with one of her prosecutors, and there was some funny money business going on. But even if she wins that case, she's unlikely to be able to pursue Trump while he's president because she has 18 other people that were indicted, some of whom have already pleaded guilty. There's a good case for her to continue, at least with those other people. But if she loses that case, it's unlikely there's any Georgia district attorney who has the guts to take on Trump and the Georgia Republicans. So looks like Trump's getting away with this, even though we got him on tape. And then the second one is business records falsification is the technical charge. That's the hush money he gave to Stormy Daniels to cover up his affair before the 2016 election. It's a campaign finance violation in the form of a business records falsification. And Trump was sentenced yesterday for 34 felonies, 2, drum roll, unconditional release. There's no one else who would get nothing for 34 penalties, but Donald Trump did. What a joke. And then the third case is him stealing and concealing classified documents. And man, there's been enough evidence just on the media, let alone what's in Jack Smith's evidence report that he wants to release. But a hack judge, Eileen Cannon, who has carried water for Trump in several cases and several decisions, threw the case out, saying Jack Smith was not legitimate as a independent prosecutor, bogus case, nobody believes it. But now that Trump was elected, Jack Smith has dropped the case because Trump was elected, and he'll have the DOJ drop it anyway. So all Smith's trying to do now is get his report on the evidence on this case out. And for the same reason, the third case was Trump's interference in the federal election, trying to prevent the confirmation of Biden's win. So he wants to release that report. He's dropped the case because Trump will drop it anyway when he gets control of the Department of Justice. So now we're in a race against time to get Smith's reports on the evidence in both cases released before Trump takes office and suppresses them, at least for another 4 years. The classified documents case is back before the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, and it'll probably go to the Supreme Court. And with 10 days left, the courts are just not going to move fast enough. So we're not going to get the evidence report on the documents case. On the election interference case, at least at this point, as far as I can tell, trying to get this straight in the media, it's kind of confusing. Jack Smith is going to be able to release the evidence that Trump interfered in the election. So at least we'll have documentation of Trump's criminal activities there on the public record, even while he's president. So, to sum up, the tally is Trump looks like he's getting away with 2 of these cases against his attempt to overthrow the election in Georgia and then federally. And third, he's going to get away with the theft of classified documents or the concealment of classified documents. He does get a sentence for 34 felonies, But that is, nothing. It's unconditional release. He doesn't have to pay a fine. He doesn't have to spend a day in jail. He just walks. Um, and then the fourth case, election interference. What am I leaving out? The Stormy Daniels case, the 34th. I got them all. So Trump is now becoming president with a Supreme Court decision last year ruling that anything he does as in office as an official act is free from criminal liability. So, Trump's crime spree may be just beginning in terms of what he can do now. So this is just a shame on this country, and an indictment not just of Trump and his crimes, but the fact that Merrick Garland, who was Biden's choice for to head the Department of Justice, Attorney General, and Biden, and Obama had wanted him to be on the Supreme Court. He waited 2 years before moving on any of these cases, which really helped Trump, use the courts to delay, and end up not paying any consequences. So that's just a sad commentary on the state of this country at this point. The other thing I'll talk about for a few minutes is what's going on with Russia's war on Ukraine. There's a lot of talk in negotiations, a lot of talk of the problems with the Ukrainian military in terms of getting enough fighters into the infantry. So starting with the negotiations, the big news this week was Zelensky had a 3-hour interview with Lex Friedman. Now, Friedman is a guy who was raised in Moscow. He lives in Texas, and he's a MAGA-aligned podcaster with 5 million YouTube subscribers. He's recently interviewed Trump and Elon Musk and Tucker Carlson. He said in this interview that Joe Rogan, a fellow Texan, was his friend. And if you listen to this interview, it's kind of entertaining. It's 3 hours. I don't know if everybody has time for that, but he kind of sounded like Medea Benjamin of Code Pink, repeatedly asking Zelensky if he would just forgive Putin. And then he premised a lot of his questions on Kremlin talking points, which I think Zelensky knew because he used it as an occasion to debunk them all. And, Zelensky was very down to earth, cracking jokes, cussing, using expletives. And I think he was very effective in responding to some of these things, like, the Ukrainian government was committing genocide against Russian-speaking people in South and Eastern Ukraine, where, of course, Zelensky is from. He's a Russian-speaking Ukrainian. And so I think he very effectively answered those questions. And I think Zelensky's purpose in going on this podcast was to speak to Donald Trump and his MAGA base, because he's got to deal with Trump now. And he said things like he trusts Trump, not Putin, and that Putin is afraid of Trump, which is the strategy of flattering Trump that a lot of people think is effective. But in the course of the discussion, Zelensky's bottom line is still, as it's been the whole time, Ukraine needs security guarantees from the West for any peace deal that they can accept. And he said he thinks Trump understands that because Trump believes in peace through strength, the old Reagan slogan. If Zelensky has a plan B besides getting Trump to help Ukraine, he didn't express it in this interview or really in any public comments since Trump was elected. I can't believe he doesn't have a plan B, but his strategy now is to, butter up Trump and try to get him to help Ukraine. Now, from the Russian side, the last thing we heard was Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov at a December 26th news conference where he said, quote, "Truce with Ukraine is a path to nowhere," end quote. And he was saying that in the context of what he'd heard from the Trump proposals for a ceasefire along the existing battle lines or front lines. And, Russia wants all 4 of the oblasts it claims to have annexed since the full-scale war began 3 years ago. So he found that unacceptable. He also added that Russia wants its own security guarantees in a peace deal, which presumably means that NATO pulls back to where it was in the Soviet era, back before Germany unified, and no other countries had joined NATO, which, and then a few days later, in another statement, Lavrov added that these security guarantees were a prerequisite for Russia resuming nuclear talks to renew or update the New START treaty. That's the last remaining nuclear arms control treaty between Russia and the US. And Russia suspended participation in it last February, and it formally expires next February. So the prospects for negotiations, if you listen to what Russia's really saying, are pretty dim. So it looks like the Russian war on Ukraine will continue. Russia's demanding capitulation from Ukraine and a security guarantee from the West, basically that would let Russia do what it will in the post-Soviet political space of the old Russian Empire, its so-called sphere of influence. Ukraine wants a security guarantee from the West for any ceasefire, which the West has not been willing to give because it would mean committing its own troops in a war with Russia if it renewed its attack on Ukraine. As we've seen over the last 3 years, the West is only willing to give Ukraine some arms for its self-defense, but not provide the security guarantees, which were in the Budapest Memorandum that we talked about a few weeks ago with Dennis Bondar. So I think when Trump confronts this impasse, he's going to realize he's not going to get this done in 1 day or 100 days, as his advisor on Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, is now saying. So he's either going to just cut off Ukraine and walk away, or he's going to continue to support Ukraine because he doesn't want to look like a loser who lost Ukraine. Now, Trump said Tuesday this week that he sympathizes with Putin's desire to keep Ukraine out of NATO, not having NATO right on Russia's doorstep, which was affirming Putin's rationale for the invasion in the first place. But the fact is, 7 countries, including the US, Germany, Belgium, Spain, Hungary, Slovakia, and Slovenia, are on the record saying they oppose an invitation to Ukraine to join NATO. And this has been the case since George W. Bush first proposed that Ukraine get on a path to NATO back in 2008. And that's because these countries don't want to extend the Article 5 NATO guarantee to defend Ukraine. So Ukraine's accession to the NATO would require a unanimous decision of all 32 NATO countries. It's not going to happen, not in the foreseeable future. So when Trump repeats Putin's rationale, he's just affirming the status quo. So I'm not sure what that means, but I'm not going to make any predictions about what Trump will do. What I also want to talk about is, can Ukraine hold out now that it looks like it's going to be a prolonged war? And the big thing people are talking about is Ukraine's shortage of infantry to hold the front lines. And the mobilization of conscripts is not popular with the people in Ukraine. And it's having problems because a lot of men are hiding underground in Ukraine or fleeing out the country. And then there have been a growing number of desertions from the Ukrainian armed forces, particularly the infantry. And all this was highlighted by something that got a lot of news if you follow this closely in the last couple of weeks. And that is what happened to the newly formed 155th Mechanized Brigade of Ukraine. And that was supposed to be a whole new brigade with, something like 5,000 troops with artillery and infantry. And these problems became public on December 31st, although a lot of people in Ukraine knew about it. Now, this brigade started forming last spring, but as it formed, 2,500 soldiers out of it were just transferred to replenish existing units on the front line. So by the time 2,000 of these soldiers were sent to France for training, 935 of the soldiers still in the unit had already gone AWOL. And when they got to France, 50 more deserted. And then when they got back, while they were in Ukraine, there were other soldiers assigned to this brigade awaiting training. 700 of them went AWOL. So they're big problems. And then when the brigade returned to Ukraine, they were immediately deployed to one of the hot spots on the front line around Pokrovsk. That was in November, and they suffered heavy losses. They were assigned to make infantry assaults against Russian positions, and another 200 members went AWOL because of that. So this, indicates serious problems with the organization and leadership of the top command of the brigade and really the whole armed forces. And before this became a big public issue, the commander was discharged, and they put the Army Chief of Staff in charge of the brigade to fix the situation. And within 2 weeks, he had a heart attack and died. It's just a mess. But those who did remain in the brigade and have been fighting on the front lines are reported now to be people who are motivated and doing pretty well now that they've got some experience. But the story broke on December 31st. By January 4th, Zelensky ordered another investigation that he would oversee, and the brigade was dismantled and its members were transferred to existing units. So that's just an indication, maybe extreme, but of the problems with the Ukrainian armed forces. And when I was in Ukraine, I heard a lot about this from soldiers and their families. They think the higher command are just leftovers from the old Soviet army who haven't learned anything, and they're upset with how the mobilization is being conducted. And I talked to half a dozen soldiers and veterans affiliated with Sotsialny Ruch, which is the left-wing democratic socialist organization in Ukraine. So it's not a scientific sample. And they were very critical of the higher command. I met most of them in Kryvyi Rih. I also met with Taras Bilis in Kyiv. I'll talk about that in a minute. The Kryvyi Rih soldiers were veterans, but a lot of the people there had family who were on the front lines. And they emphasized to me that it was soldiers on the front lines who self-organized, and also volunteer citizens in the territorial defense forces that were formed right when the invasion started, that on their own initiative were more effective than the high command. They say these units were, the self-organized people were responsible for defeating Russia's assault on Kyiv in the first days of the war, and they've been the most effective defenders on the eastern and southern fronts. So what they're saying is they got to have more initiative and control at the base of the army to be effective. And they also criticize armed forces for not doing frequent enough rotations so people can, get physical, emotional, mental recovery, and that they don't have fixed terms of service. Once you're in the armed forces, you're in for the duration, which discourages new people from getting involved. Now, I heard these criticisms also from the wives of soldiers when I was in Lviv in Western Ukraine. And all these people said if they had regular rotations and fixed terms of service, they wouldn't have such problems with mobilization and getting motivated volunteers and conscripts, because they know how long their service was, and they know they get, some breaks in the course of their combat. Now, I met with the Kryvyi Rih Veterans Union when I was in that city, and they also they made a point of saying, if the commanders and the oligarchs behind the Kyiv government don't get their act together, there are 5 million arms in the hands of Ukrainians who could take matters into their own hands. And, they're pretty angry. And these guys aren't even fighting. They're veterans now of the Ukrainian armed forces. And when they said that, I asked them if you meant like the Portuguese armed forces movement that initiated the Carnation Revolution in 1974 that overthrew the Salazar dictatorship and freed the Portuguese colonies. And they said, no, our model is Nestor Makhno's Revolutionary Insurgent Army, which was the anarchist communist movement during Ukraine's War of Independence between 1918 and 1921, the time of the Russian Revolution. And Makhno's movement fought in alliance with the Bolsheviks' Red Army to defeat the Whites, the White Army, the reactionaries that wanted to restore the Tsarist regime. But then the Red Army turned on the anarchists because they wanted to control the whole thing. So Makhno's army fought them too for Ukrainian independence and for their radical program of expropriating, redistributing, collectivizing the land of the largest states and the private properties of the mines and manufacturing plants, and then governing Ukraine from below as a federation of village and city communes with elected Soviets or councils. And where they had control, that's what they did when they had control of the territory. One of the people in the course of this discussion, Yuri Samoylov, who is the head of the Independent Miners Union of Ukraine, whose son is fighting on the front lines, he then told me, he'd show me the balcony from which Nestor Makhno gave speeches to people in Kryvyi Rih, an urban area, whereas this is more a peasant-based movement, hoping to mobilize the mine workers into alliance or into his revolutionary insurgent army. But before we could do that, a Russian ballistic missile hit a nearby 5-story apartment building near where the balcony was. The morning we were going, it killed 3 children and a woman and injured 19 others and damaged 35, mostly apartment buildings in the area. I heard the explosion. At the time, I was several miles away. So the area was cordoned off, and Yuri instead took me on a tour of the iron ore fields and the slag heaps and the open pit mines, which is, a reddish landscape. It looks like a Martian landscape. And Yuri quipped that the Ukrainian miners got to Mars before Elon Musk did. Now, on the soldiers, half of his miners are fighting on the front lines. And he said that he thought 90% of the soldiers would welcome a ceasefire just to get some respite from the physical and emotional exhaustion. But he also said that doesn't mean they want to accept Russia's occupation. They want a more effective armed forces command that doesn't burn out the fighters. So then I talked with Taras Bilis the next week back in Kyiv. And Taras, as you may know, received the Daniel Singer Prize for an essay on the need for a new international security system to protect smaller nations like Ukraine from attack by larger nations like Russia. And the UN has failed in that regard. So when I talked with Taras, we didn't talk about the problems of mobilization. We talked about the election of Donald Trump. And, in his opinion, that was a huge victory for the Putin-allied far right in the West. And he was kind of depressed. His hope had been, he said, that the international left would take the lead on developing this new effective international security system. And he said he hoped it could be done in, a few years because of the obvious violation of international law by Russia's aggression and the failure of the UN and the existing system to stop it. Now, he said, with Trump's election, he thought it's going to take decades. It's interesting that when I met with the Green Party leaders in Ukraine, they had the same concerns. They were saying that the left, particularly the West European Greens, need to put forward a positive solution in terms of a new international security system instead of just protesting Russia's invasion. They said we need a positive system a positive vision of system change, not just protests. And actually, people on the left are working on that. There's a paper just came out 2 days ago by 2 exiled anti-war Russian leftists called On Overcoming the Rivalry Between Military Blocs in Europe, where they sketch out what a new international security system might look like. And we'll put that link in the chat. And I urge you to read it. It's a thoughtful piece. And it's part of a larger project they were contributing to that people on the left in Europe, East and West, are starting to work on. Now, everybody I talked to in Ukraine wanted to know what I thought of Trump, what his election meant for Ukraine in particular. And the leftists I talked to thought it was bad news for Ukraine, like Taras Bilis did. Most of the other just regular folks, not necessarily political people, were hopeful that Trump would be better than Biden. And everybody I talked to, whether they're on the left or just regular folks, were very unhappy with Biden's policy of so-called managed escalation, which delayed the provision of advanced weapons and the full sanctioning of Russia's fossil fuel exports. And they just didn't understand the half-assed support that Biden was giving Ukraine. They said, we're not escalating, we're defending, and Biden shouldn't have been afraid of that. So everybody's critical of Biden, but the regular people were hopeful that Trump was going to be on their side. I'm not going to make a prediction as to what Trump does, but while we wait and see what he does about Ukraine and then figure out how we should respond, there's one thing we can do now, and that's to support those miners' families who don't have power and heat this winter because of Russia's bombing of Ukraine's energy plants and infrastructure. Not just now electricity, but also the heating plants. A lot of these cities have district heating. So they take out the district heating plant and nobody has heat. So we'll put this in the chat as well. It's Ukraine Solidarity Network is raising money for generators that will be distributed by the Miners Union and also the Railway Workers Union. And I know some of you have contributed. I hope more of you will. So we'll put the link in the chat, and that's something we can do till we figure out what Trump's doing. So I will stop there and see what you got to say. Andrew Hager, back to the elephant in the room. What can we do to stop Trump from so much as stepping foot in the White House? I mean, some people are saying that the Senate on January 6th should, and representatives in the House should appeal to the Senate, and then Harris should accept their objection to the election. I don't know what good grounds they have. There's not a lot of fraud. Before the election, there was a lot of, restricting access to the ballot, voter registrations, people being pulled off the rolls. Greg Palast is working on that, and it probably had an influence. It always does, going back to Bush versus Gore in Florida, where they knocked 200,000 black people off the rolls before that election, who would have voted overwhelmingly for Gore or Bush. So that's an ongoing thing. But I don't think that's what we got to do. We got to resist what Trump does. And not just resist what he does, but start putting forward our own positive program. And, as I've argued here, and I'm going to write an article about this, we need to go back to the base, and we need to build local Green parties or other left parties that are active in issues in our communities, start electing people to local office, create a bench of people that can then get elected to state legislatures and in the House of Representatives. And while Trump's in office, we need to build this opposition from below. Because right now we're too weak. We can't call national demonstration that Trump will be intimidated by. We don't have access to the media. We just don't have influence at the federal government. So we need to start building a radical opposition, because the Democrats are sure not providing it. I mean, we saw this, with Harris, adopting the Republican immigration policy, saying she would sign the bill that Trump didn't, because Trump wanted to keep it as a campaign issue. They've just been reinforcing the Republican narrative on that issue and other issues, like the way she answered the question on climate change by bragging how much oil and gas the U.S. produced and that she supported fracking. I mean, that's not an opposition. The policy of and you're hearing it now, bipartisanship with the party that tried to overthrow Biden's election and isn't interested in bipartisanship. They're rule or ruin. That's the way the Republican Party operates. We've got to defeat them politically, not try to work with them and compromise with them, because that just pulls the whole spectrum to the right. That's why we need to be building a left. So that's one thing. And then there are going to be things like mass deportations. And that's where we can get our local government, sheriff's departments, police departments not to cooperate with ICE in holding immigrants who are detained, say, for driving without a license, because a lot of them can't get licenses, but they need to drive to get to work, get groceries for the family, and so forth. So we need to be working at the local level, just like local governments and states resisted the Fugitive Slave Act in the 1850s. And I mentioned immigration. That's the most obvious case. But there are going to be a lot of instances where local and state government can resist Trump policies and put forward positive alternatives. And we should be in the center of advocating that as we build up our local parties and start electing our own people into local office and then state office and in the House. So I think that's, wait a minute, January 6th, they already certified Trump's election. Yeah, I was thinking of discussions I heard before. I mean, that horse has left the barn. So I don't think we should be focusing on that. We should be focusing on building our resistance and building our alternative. Vicky Corden, I'm also worried about militias and Christian nationalists. Florida is infested. Yeah, so is upstate New York, where I live. Private militias are illegal in every state. So that's a state law that we should demand our attorneys general or district attorneys enforce. And then the Christian nationalists, I mean, they've got their own very well organized and funded institutional base in the evangelical churches and to some extent the more conservative Catholic churches. And we've got to just defeat them by, presenting our alternative positively, which will appeal to people who want freedom, want equality. And we got to do that with an independent political movement of the left, because the Democrats won't take them on. They're trying to compromise and even AOC said something about working across the aisle on some damn issue. We need an opposition that is really an opposition. And we got to hope that will appeal to many people. I mean, the far right, the Christian nationalists, as a percentage of society, have been shrinking for a couple generations. I mean, you look at the white working class vote for the combination of George Wallace, the states' rights segregationist in 1968 for president, and Richard Nixon, who had his Southern strategy, the dog whistle racist campaign. Together, they got 64% of the vote in 1968. You look at Trump's vote, maybe 35% at maximum is this far-right racist vote. The other 15% are mostly upscale people who want to get tax breaks and don't want to pay taxes for any redistributive or social safety net policies. They're like the country club Republicans we've always had. And then some people who felt that Biden was so bad and they were hurting so much that we just got to switch horses and, Trump's the alternative. So he got some of those votes. That's how he got almost 50% of the vote. But that's still a lot less than Wallace and Nixon got. And if you look at surveys, and this is in that article I talked about last week that'll be in New Politics, I review some of this. The racial attitudes of white Americans have become more tolerant significantly since the 1960s and 70s when the white backlash politically began. And certainly their expressed attitudes about equality have much improved. When it comes to practice and policy, not so much, but still improved. So I'm saying, we're the majority. The progressive-minded in America are the majority. And so rather than worrying about the Christian nationalists, we need to worry about ourselves and get organized and get the power we're entitled to by our numbers. But the militias, we should be trying to get legal action against them because they're illegal under state law all over the country. Andrew Hager, I can't help wondering what kind of taxes would be helpful in so much as scaring the pants off Trump. What would scare the pants off him is if his own base started to turn on him. He doesn't care about the rest of us. He has always been a candidate that, appeals to his base and hopes it will be enough. So, how do we appeal to that base? Well, part of it, had economic concerns, and Trump is not going to relieve them, particularly if he goes ahead with his crazy tariff plans and his cutbacks in social programs that will undermine demand in the economy, and those will head us toward a recession. There's a huge the stock market is way overvalued. The levels of debt in the global South are higher than they've ever been. The United States debt is rising. I mean, all these debts are never going to be all paid off. And at some point when they start to default, there could be a downward spiral and we'll be in a depression. So Trump is, that it's not us. It's basically problems with the capitalist economy that are coming due that Trump is going to have to face. That's going to scare him. And that may cause him to back off some of the public spending cuts. I don't know if he's going to back off the tariffs, but I think those things will scare him. And that will erode part of his base who are counting on him to improve their economic circumstances. That part of his base is scarable. The part of the base that is there because they're just white supremacists and they want to maintain their, higher status and protect themselves from competition from other people, women and people of color in competition for good jobs and college educations. Those people are pretty stuck in their ways. Their children are starting to, become more progressive, but they're going to go away when they die out. So that part of his base, I don't think will lose. They're just going to stick with him because their whole politics is about punching down and scapegoating people and hating people that they think are their problem, when in fact it's the system and the billionaire class. So I think the people that might get scared, or that might scare Trump because he's losing them, are the people that are counting on him for economic relief and they're not going to get it. Vicky Corden. Elon Musk is also helping Trump financially just to push Trump's agenda. I guess it is about follow the money. Yeah, I was looking at this. I read something and it had the dollar amounts and I couldn't find it, but I did find reports on how many billionaires were backing Trump and Harris. And billionaires, not just multimillionaires. And there was, I think, 13 for Trump and 20 for Harris. And those people give their money. They aren't just, this isn't just charity for them. This is an investment. They expect to get something in return. And Musk, who is the biggest contributor to Trump, and this is outside the FEC, this is super PAC stuff, dark money that can't be held accountable. He's getting what he wants. Like he doesn't really want to go after China and Russia because he's got business interests there, particularly in China. And he doesn't want high tech regulated. And so that's what he's getting from Trump. And that's why he's going to be a big influence. Although a lot of people have said this, they both have such big egos that it's only a matter of time before there's a falling out. But I think Musk and his business interests will be willing to play second fiddle to Trump so he can protect his business interests. So the other thing that's scary about Trump is he's now promoting far-right politicians and parties in Europe. The Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, which is a party with Nazi roots and is strongly anti-immigrant and pro-Putin. And Nigel Farage is, what do they call themselves now? The Reform Party in Britain, which is the same politics. And, may surpass the conservatives in the next election in Britain. At least that's the way they're polling right now. And it's a far right, anti-immigrant party. And Musk is pushing that. You got to remember, Musk is a white supremacist. He grew up in South Africa. His money comes from, mines where blacks worked as semi-slaves. And him and some of the other billionaires back in Trump, like David Sachs and Peter Thiel, also have roots in South Africa. And if you read about their views, they are not just cultural racists, they're biological racists. I mean, they're the crudest racists. And they're trying to, revive the bullshit about, intelligence tests, and the differences between people of different ethnic groups. And that's a big thing in Palo Alto, which is, where Silicon Valley is, Stanford University. That's where all that stuff, the so-called scientific studies on that began. And they're reviving it. There's a great book, I think it's just called Palo Alto, that came out last year. I read it recently, and it's kind of a history of American capitalism from the point of view of Palo Alto, which is, where it got started with the railroad barons in the San Francisco Bay Area, and then went into the defense industry, which was big there, and then high tech. And Stanford was right in the middle of that. And it was a hub for these far right, or at least very conservative business and political interests. It's a fascinating book. I hope I got the title right. It's like 600 pages. It took a while to read. Actually, I listened to most of it, but it's a very well-written book, and it gives you a real good history of American capitalism from the viewpoint of Palo Alto. So, and you can see how people like Musk and Thiel and Sachs fit into that mentality coming out of there. Andrew Hager, it's times like this. I have one question. What would Edward Snowden do? I said during the campaign that I would have him advise my presidential administration, which was not going to happen, but if a hypothetical, on how to regulate, the classified information in a way that would allow for maximum transparency while still protecting legitimate national security interests. And I thought he had a good take on that in his book, his biography of, how he came to release the documents he did, and how he ended up in Russia, which is not where he wanted to be, was very compelling. It was the best book I read in 2019. Although I have to say, reading his Twitter feed over the last few years, he's become a libertarian and kind of a post-left. He never was on the left. He was a libertarian, but he's in the camp of those, post-left people that move from the left to the far right, like, or at least apologists for the right, like Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald. So I don't know if I'd ask what Edward Snowden would do now. I think, his political project is, kind of libertarian, not really concerned with, social equality, economic equality. I don't know if he has a well-formed idea about international relations. I do remember that he was tweeting before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine that Russia would never invade. And then when they did, he said, I was wrong. I'm going to take a vacation from Twitter, which he did for a few months. But when he came back, he wasn't making as much sense to me. So I might still have Edward Snowden advise on, how to handle, national security questions related to information, surveillance, classified information. But that's about it. Joanna Munley, your interviews in Europe, Ukraine were very interesting. Were you afraid to enter Ukraine? How difficult was it to set up the trip considering the war? And how do Ukrainians feel about Zelensky? Well, I wasn't afraid to enter Ukraine. I was actually more afraid to go into Georgia because they're having an election, and either way it was reported out could have led to violent street protests and maybe difficulty getting out. And of course, if there was people on the street that had similar politics to me, I was going to be out there with them, at least recording what was going on. So I was actually had more trepidation about Georgia than Ukraine. Going into Ukraine, it was interesting. I took a bus from Warsaw, Poland to Kyiv, and I was the only male on that bus. It was all females going back, mainly to visit family. Males outside the country aren't going back in, and if they're in there, they can't go out unless they're over 60 or under 18. And, as soon as I got there were air raid alarms. And, people were pretty relaxed about it. They said, we'll go to the shelter if we start hearing explosions. But if we went to the shelter every time there was air raids, we would never get anything done. And, I keep that on, and, you see those air raids right there, that's just today. They're getting warned, it says there's an air alert in Kyiv, proceed to shelter. Increased, that was 38 minutes ago, 31 minutes ago, increased air threat in Kyiv, please stay in shelter. And then 31 minutes ago, watch out for further information. How are you? So Kyiv is under air alert. And this app that I got in Ukraine, I could set it up for any city or oblast in Ukraine. They're under constant bombardment by the Russians. Now, while I was there, I heard two explosions. One was when I was in Kyiv, a few days after I was there, and it hit the Taras Shevchenko National University, where the guy hosting me, Dennis Pilash, teaches. And so at that point, they went online with all their classes instead of going to the university. And he had to spend the day, physical labor, cleaning up the mess that explosion left at the building at the university it hit. And then when I was in Kryvyi Rih, I mentioned this before, I was going to, Yuri Samoilov, the president of the miners union, was going to show me the balcony from which Nestor Makhno gave his speeches. And couldn't go because it was cordoned off because Russia had sent a ballistic missile into a residential building. And I heard that explosion, even though I was several miles away. But it's kind of like getting struck by lightning. You just feel like you can't do anything about it, so you just hope for the best. So I didn't, it wasn't like I was, hovering in a corner afraid. It was just a kind of a thing you were aware of. And then how do Ukrainians feel about Zelensky? It's mixed. The latest poll I saw was 52% support him, 38% don't, which is down. I mean, soon after the war, people rallied around him. He was over 90%, but it's eroded over the years. The leftists I was with are very critical of Zelensky because he's implemented this neoliberal economic program. In fact, I was on a call earlier today with the European Network in solidarity with Ukraine, and these damn parliamentarians who are from these very libertarian kind of parties, like the Servant of the People, that's Zelensky's party, and Holos, have introduced a further deregulation of the labor code, which makes it hard for people to organize, secure benefits, and bargain for wages, working conditions, and benefits. And they're very critical that he's relying on the private sector to mobilize industry for the defense effort. And there's, studies that some of these leftists have done that shows there's enormous underutilization of the capacity that Ukraine has. And they advocate for a war mobilization. nationalize some of these industries, or at least have a plan where the private industries have to participate in, so you can maximize the production of ammunition and drones. And now Ukraine's pretty sophisticated. It was a center of military of Russia's, or the Soviet Union's military industrial complex before the Soviet Union broke up. So there's a lot of factories and people with skills and knowledge that can do that. And Ukraine is doing that. The problem is they're so broke they can only do it at a certain scale. So the left is very critical of Zelensky in terms of domestic policy and the war mobilization. As I was mentioning earlier, the high command of the armed forces are still kind of in old Soviet mode, which upsets these leftists. And, the mobilization, there's a real class bias in who gets mobilized. One of the policies they really hate is that if you're making above a certain level, they won't draft you because you're paying more taxes than somebody who's making less. So the working class is doing the fighting, and the middle classes are, behind the front lines, contributing in different ways, but they feel that's, not a fair burden. So those are the kinds of criticisms I heard from the left. And I was hosted by the left. So it wasn't difficult to set up the trip in Ukraine because Sotsial Ruk said, just get here and we'll find things for you to do. And they kept me fully busy. In Georgia, the Greens were very helpful and set up a lot of meetings, incredible meetings I had with, grassroots environmental movements for, a different development model than being a transit hub between China and Europe, which is kind of the historic role of Georgia, going back to the Silk Road, and doesn't allow for their own development. It's a very poor country. So, when I got to Western Europe, the Greens, it varied from country to country. Some of them were kind of aloof like Germany. Some were very friendly like the Czechs, the Green Party of England and Wales. But I caught up to the Germans in Dublin at the European Greens Congress. So that part was more difficult, also more expensive. It's really cheap in Georgia and Ukraine, and people were buying me meals and putting me up. So I actually had more money in my bank account after being in Georgia and Ukraine than I had going in. I did spend more money. The further west I went, the more expensive it got, particularly in England and Dublin. And that was kind of flying by the seat of my pants because, I had written to these people and, someone said, yeah, let's meet, we'll figure it out when you get here. And, I didn't know, like in Germany, I was put up, but I wasn't in the Czech Republic, for example. So that part of the trip was more ad hoc. So I don't know what else to tell you, but I'd never been to Europe, really never been out of the country much. And so this was 8 weeks, quite an adventure. Scout Trooper 164, views on the interview that Lex Friedman had with Zelensky. I don't know if you're on, Scout Trooper, but I was talking about that at the beginning. Just briefly, Lex Friedman is a MAGA friendly podcaster. He's interviewed, Trump and Elon Musk and Tucker Carlson. And he was basically, I said, he sounded like Medea Benjamin and Cold Pink in the kind of questions he was asking. Can't you just forgive Putin? Is what he's asking Zelensky. Zelensky had a good answer. No. The guy invaded our country, killed a lot of our people, imprisoned our people, stole our children, destroying our infrastructure. Hell no. But he said, we got to end the war, Zelensky said. And then Lex Friedman's questions were premised on Kremlin talking points, which I said, that's why I think Zelensky took this interview, because it gave him a chance to answer those points to the MAGA audience and Donald Trump. So if that was his goal, I think he was effective. Dennis Bondar, who was on the podcast a few weeks ago, said that Zelensky has no plan B. It's all about Trump. Zelensky was buttering up Trump, hoping to get him on his side. what's plan B if that doesn't work? And Zelensky hasn't been talking about that. I'm sure there is one. I can't believe that they're totally counting on Trump. But in this interview, you wouldn't have known it. He was flattering Trump. So what Trump does remains to be seen. I said I'm not going to predict. But I also said it's 3 hours, but it's pretty entertaining. So if you got a little time to kill, it's worth listening to. Scout Trooper 164, do you think we're entering the final stage of capitalism with people getting fed up with the rich or not? They've been talking about the final stage of capitalism for a century. And they argue that capitalism is going to have a crisis, and then the left will be able to take advantage of it. We're not in the final stage of capitalism because we don't have a left. We don't have a strong left anywhere in the world, except in a few locations like Rojava in Syria, the northwest area. The Kurds are the majority in and have a autonomous, self-governing region, and a commitment to feminism and ecology and anti-sectarian in terms of religion and ethnicity. But there are very few places where the left has that kind of power and influence in their own areas. And until that happens, and then is able to build out and win over the masses of people to a system change program, not just demanding reforms, capitalism is going to be with us. And it's not going to collapse of its own internal problems. It will create problems. It'll create protests. But a system change movement, that's the responsibility of the left to build. And we've really fallen down on that, particularly in the last almost a century now. I mean, the left was really rising in the late 19th century, early 20th century to World War I, really until the 30s. And, since then, it's been split. The Stalinists had too much influence, and, that pushed away a lot of people who didn't like the authoritarian Soviet regime. And then the other major wing, the Social Democrats, made their peace with capitalism, and they just wanted a capitalism with a welfare state. And then there's a third camp of international socialism, which has been a minor thread. That's what I would consider myself part of. But it's still, a minority within the left. And, in terms of broader society, it's something that's got an intellectual tradition, but not a mass organization tradition. We got to build that left. Via email, thoughts on the escalating bird flu spread and the possibility of another pandemic under Trump? Yeah, I think the Biden administration is not taking it seriously enough, and Trump is going to, blame it as another Chinese hoax or some stupid thing. So yeah, it could be. At this point, as I understand it, there's not a strain that is easily transmissible among humans. Most of the transmission is coming from, dairy cows to dairy workers, as I understand it. And then I was reading the other day, there was a case of that being transmitted human to human. But it, as I recall, it said that strain didn't look like it was contagious for humans. But that could change. And it could become contagious. And then it's very deadly. I think it's like a third of the people who get it die. So it's something on the horizon. And of course, Trump is an idiot on this stuff. He doesn't believe in science or listen to scientifically trained advisors. We could be in a world of trouble if the bird flu does spread. So I think it's something to keep an eye on. And it's been suggested I have a guest on to talk about where we're at with COVID. I think I know of someone who could also talk about bird flu spread. And Actually did a lot of public health work in Ukraine since around 2000, which would be an interesting angle. So maybe we'll have him on soon. Violeted Content Boutique. Hi there, Chris, Howie, Chris, and fam. Howie, any comments on the California fires? Yeah, it's devastating. It was predictable. If we had rational, ecologically oriented city planning, we would not be building in the areas that have been devastated. And hopefully that's what comes out of this, that, we learn to, not try to defy nature, but work with it. And when I turn on the news to find out what's going on, I'm looking for kind of a sense of where the fires are at and where they might go. And I really don't get a good sense of that because they do a lot of, interviews with people that went through the experience, which, that's part of the news, but it's been hard to get a grasp of where they are on the map and where they might go on the map. Although, because I've been looking around, including online, I have a pretty good idea. And I know the Santa Ana winds are picking up this weekend again, which is a bad sign. So, but I think, once the fires are out and thoughts come to get to rebuilding, at least Greens should be pushing for rebuilding in an ecologically sane way. And of course, behind all this is climate change and the warming and drought that California has experienced. And that has to be remembered so that we need to, that's another thing that we got 4 years where Trump is going to make it worse for sure. Not that, the major countries of the world have done much since the Paris Accord said we'd try to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Last year, we were 1.6 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. So we are hurtling toward the abyss. And, in that regard, I just go back to saying, we're not probably going to have much influence on Trump. The Democrats aren't going to fight him on climate. Look at what Harris did in that debate. But we can begin to do stuff in our communities, whether it's Los Angeles or, Ithaca, New York had a Green New Deal or has a Green New Deal. And while it can't zero out all carbon emissions, it is focused on the built sector and the transportation sector. And it's done a lot of good work, and also the power production sector. So we can begin to do that in our communities and show how it's done and that it can be done and that it's economically beneficial. So then we can scale it up when we get past Trump. Okay, time is up. Just want to answer Andrew Hager. Do I have a Blue Sky account? I do. I can't tell you what the handle is off the top of my head. And I'm not leaving any other platforms. Not that I use them all. I don't use Threads. I tweet once in a while. Yeah, there's the question. And the Green Party, I think they are talking about going to Blue Sky, if I'm not mistaken, but I don't know. Yeah, Twitter X is Elon Musk's thing, and it's degenerating. The algorithms. I've noticed how, what shows up on my feed is a lot of MAGA shit. But I'm not leaving them because I have audience there. So I'm now beginning to post on both Twitter and Blue Sky. That's where I mostly post myself. Chris sort of has stuff left over from the campaign and about, this podcast and some other things that he puts on Facebook as well as Twitter. And I guess some Instagram. But I'm not an online social media guy that much. I still read books. And my email keeps me busy enough. So anyway, but I do have a Blue Sky account to answer your question. So Next week, I got to be at a conference in Chicago. It's about the inter-imperial rivalry between capitalist China and capitalist West, and the U.S. in particular. And it's about, building solidarity from below between working people and popular classes in both the Chinese sphere and the Western sphere. And while I'll be in a workshop when the podcast normally happens. So what I hope to do this week is tape a podcast with somebody that will be broadcast live streamed at 3:00 next Saturday. That seems to be the best thing I can do. So when we shut down here, I'm going to be talking to Chris about that. But thanks, people, for being here. And next week won't be we'll have interaction on the chat, but there will be a Green Socialist Notes. And then the week after, I'll be back myself live. So in the meantime, everybody, stay with it. We do make a difference, and keep the faith. So have a good week.